as a shy, unassuming college student and became the first bad boy of rock. In the swinging 60s, his voice and looks became synonymous with youthful rebellion and outrageous behavior. His sexual ambiguity appalled parents and drove young audiences into a frenzy. His drug trials and conflicts with authority, his turbulent marriages and sexual escapades have made him the ultimate icon of rock. On a bleak railroad platform in southeast England in the fall of 1961, a young economics student waited here for the morning train to London, with a batch of American blues records under his arm. On the same platform, he bumped into a childhood friend, clutching his guitar. They fell into avid conversation and discovered a shared passion for the blues. Mick Jagger and Keith Richard boarded the same train, and the world's greatest rock and roll legend was born. Dartford, a small blue-collar town close to London, and in July 1943, Michael Philip Jagger's birthplace. He was raised in the suburbs at 39 Denver Road, his father a physical education instructor, his mother a meticulous housekeeper. His primary school was 2 blocks away, where he experienced a fleeting encounter with destiny. One of his playmates was Keith Richard, who lived close by. A shy little boy, he told Michael he wanted to be a cowboy when he grew up and play the guitar. Michael said he wanted to own a red Cadillac. But fate drew them apart. When he was 10 years old, Jagger's parents moved to an upper-middle-class neighborhood and a grander home. In 1954, Jagger started at Dartford Grammar School, one of the best in the area, where he was regarded as a model pupil.
My recollection is that he was pleasant, helpful, and I must say that some people have tried to make out that he was a troublemaker or involved in some sort of anti-establishment movement. I have no recollection of him being involved in that sort of thing at all. He was a very sober, thoughtful student, one of a very good group, really talented boys.
Mick was a very good basketball player. In fact, we played in the same team together in Dartford Grammar School. And he was a very good cross-country runner, having beaten me several times at cross-country. I saw no evidence in all the years that I knew Mick of him being a rebel or anyone that would buck the traces at all. He certainly didn't stand out in a crowd.
The 13-year-old Michael did have an early brush with stardom. In 1956, he appeared on a TV show, Seeing Sport, with his father, Joe.
Joe here is going up first, and Michael is paying out his rope to him. He's the number 2.
Number 2.
Yes, he shouted down and he's ready.
Mick at home lived a quite disciplined life, actually. I remember going there one day, and we were going out, and I distinctly remember his father saying, "Before you go, you have got to work out. You know, you can't do anything before you work out."
Mick would come to my house here and we would play latest records. And Mick's musical tastes were completely different from those of his contemporaries. Mick was always tuned into AFN, the American Forces Network, and he invariably had information and the background on the latest hits from all the rhythm and blues singers, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley. He was really into that kind of music.
Mimicking his American idols, he started singing the blues with Dick Taylor and 2 other friends in a fledgling band they called Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys.
We chiefly used to rehearse around my parents' house. And one of Mick's favourite things was La Bamba in a sort of pseudo-Spanish accent. And Mick would grab the microphone and he would be just totally into it. He'd be singing and dancing, kind of just as he always does now. It's the same person. The first people who would really have ever seen Mick performing would have been my sister and my mum, because my mum would be forever bringing in Jaffa cakes and cups of tea and really secretly be giggling away in the kitchen. She thought it was absolutely brilliant.
After that chance encounter at Dartford Station with Mick, Keith Richard joined the Blue Boys. They were soon traveling to London to hear other bands play. Hidden away in a quiet, rundown corner of West London, the boys from Dartford discovered their musical paradise. This dingy passageway led to the entrance of the Ealing Club, the only place in Britain where rhythm and blues was played on a regular basis. One man who often sang and played there was a godfather of the emerging British blues movement.
This is a cold evening, snow laying on the ground.
The Ealing Club was like a cradle for the British blues, really. Everybody used to get down there either to see a band or meet other people. I mean, the place used to be packed solid. You just all wanted to go and see the music, and that's how we all got to know each other.
Early in 1962, Knight struck up a friendship with one of the club's most talented hopefuls, a 20-year-old musician called Brian Jones, who had moved to London from the English spa town of Cheltenham. Like Jagger, his parents were comfortably off, and he went to one of the best schools in the area, Cheltenham Grammar School, and sang in the local choir. But his real passion was for the American blues.
Brian asked me if I wanted to join his band and play harmonica and sing. And I said yes, why not? The rehearsals went all right, but we had a difference of opinion on what was rhythm and blues and what wasn't. I wanted a more purist type R&B. That's why I left in the end. And then Brian got Mick Jagger involved and Keith Richard, and hence became the Rolling Stones.
With Jagger, Jones felt he had found the perfect replacement for Knight. Mick had already sung several times at the Ealing Club. It was in this corner that Brian Jones recruited him and Keith Richard to his band. But Jagger faced an immediate dilemma. He had become a full-time student at the London School of Economics and was doing well. He was torn between his music and his studies, between a life in show business and a future in finance. The 19-year-old singer shared an apartment with Brian and Keith at Edith Grove in London's Chelsea district. It became the band's headquarters. Inspiration for their name came from a Muddy Waters song, Rollin' Stone Blues. The group's lineup was finalized with the arrival of drummer Charlie Watts and bass player Bill Wyman. Early in 1963, their lives changed forever. A new blues club had opened at a pub in the London suburb of Richmond, and the group were invited to play. The club's founder was a blues fanatic and the Stones' first promoter.
But the first night, there was 3 people in the audience. And the Rolling Stones were 6 at the time. And Brian Jones said to me, the 6 of us, and there's only 3 in the audience. So I used some old shamanistic trick. I said, you know, how many people should there be here? Imagine you playing to 100 people. And they went on and did this incredible show to 3 people, you know, which probably was the best show that Mick and everybody else ever did.
I love you, baby, till my jeans. I don't want you to wash my clothes. I don't want you to keep my home. I don't want, 'cause I'm sad and blue. I just wanna make love to you, baby, love.
Word of the Rolling Stones and their charismatic lead singer was spreading. They were soon in demand and in need of a manager. Brian enlisted the help of a music journalist to find one.
I did think then of the young Andrew Oldham, who was a kind of social figure in the then Shaftesbury Avenue type pop scene. And he used to hang around. He wanted to do anything in show business. I knew that he had worked with the Beatles for a little while and with Brian Epstein on publicity for them, but he'd lost that job. But he was full of confidence. I mean, this was super confidence, really.
In May 1963, the young Andrew Oldham became the Stones' official manager and started to exploit their commercial potential.
I think he realized fairly quickly that with the Rolling Stones he had very promising material to present them as being very obnoxious, as if you like, the anti-stars to the Beatles. It was quite calculated. He made them into groups that parents would hate, and it really worked by accentuating the long hair and the lack of band uniforms and the scruffiness. There were often pictures of the Rolling Stones picking their noses or pulling faces or just doing things which at the time were completely unacceptable. The whole idea was to present them as sort of Neanderthals.
My first photo session with the Stones took place in my studio, Mason's Yard, which was behind Piccadilly in the centre of London. We found this builder's site, and there was this fantastic cage that they used for taking the bricks up to the upper stories of the building site. And I put the band in and around this cage. And that encapsulated a lot of rather negative press view that was going on. This stuff about the Stones being wild and dirty and long-haired, and would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone, which of course was absolutely wonderful for Andrew and the Stones. I mean, he, of all managers, was the absolute best at exploiting this sort of negative view.
It worked. The Stones were forced to relocate to the Richmond Athletic Club for their regular gig after negative publicity banished them from the Richmond pub. Their audiences grew dramatically. Oldham had identified the group's magnetic force. It was Jagger's energy and oddness that drew the crowds. Brian Jones had started the band, but Oldham had already decided Jagger, and not Jones, was to be its star.
When the band started off, it was to be a rhythm and blues band. And that's what you saw for the first year when you went to see them on stage. They were covers of Chuck Berry, Howling Wolf, Muddy Waters. Those are the people they venerated. It changed when Andrew Oldham realized that the Beatles were picking up a fortune in music publishing by writing their own songs. And this is where all the big money was to be made. And so he locked Keith and Mick into a kitchen in Edith Grove and said, don't come out until you've written a song.
The first song they wrote was not for the Rolling Stones. Instead, it was recorded by one of America's biggest and most established stars. One of the first Jagger-Richards songwriting hits came in 1963 and was not for the Stones, but for a singer from a small town in distant Connecticut, who, with the truckers' anthem 24 Hours from Tulsa, was already a household name.
Jagger and Richards had written a song, That Girl Belongs to Yesterday. So I said to them, look, can I change the melody? We'll keep the words exactly as they are, but we'll change the melody to fit the track, but also to fit the way that I can sing. We'll make it bigger, and I can use some harmonies and things like that. So they said, yeah, go ahead, we'll try it. We did it. It came out terrific, and it became the very first Jagger-Richards composition that was in the American charts.
It was almost a year before Jagger and Richard wrote an original single for the Stones. Meanwhile, a punishing schedule of one-night stands the length and breadth of Britain increased their fan base outside London. In the space of 3 months, the Stones went from local novelty band to national fixation. In the recording studios, things were not going so well, as the Stones struggled to produce their third release, a cover of the Buddy Holly number, Not Fade Away.
I had a call from Andrew Oldham, and Andrew said, you got to help me, because he said the record company is screaming for a new release, and he said, I've got the boys, we're in the studio right now, but he said they hate each other today, and let alone sing, they won't even talk to each other. And we concocted a story. We had 5/5 of cognac that we were bringing home, and we took 1 or 2 bottles of cognac, went to the studio and told them, fabricated this story that it was my birthday and that we had a tradition in the family that everybody had to have a water glass of cognac. And it worked. It broke the ice and loosened things up. It was the Not Fade Away session.
While the Stones were becoming well established in the UK, they still needed to break into the highly lucrative American market, something most British bands had failed to achieve.
Andrew had one thing that he kept on about from the time he got up to the time he went to bed at night, and that was America. The Beatles hadn't really paid attention to America. All Andrew wanted to do was go to America. He knew that if we broke in America, they were on a home run.
When the Stones arrived there for the first time in June 1964, their hopes ran high. This was the world's largest music market, and Not Fade Away had entered the US charts. Their fan base was still small, but 500 enthusiastic teenagers greeted them at New York's Kennedy Airport. There was a cooler reaction by the public at large to the Stones' untamed appearance. Their 3-week US tour met with a mixed reaction. Only on the East and West coasts were there large audiences. For Jagger, the highlight of the trip was a recording session at the legendary Chess Studios in Chicago. It was the fulfillment of a boyhood dream. Two of Jagger's childhood idols were present: Willie Dixon, who complimented Jagger on his singing voice, and Chuck Berry, whose music had been such a major inspiration for the young blues singer from Dartford. The recording session at Chess transformed the Stones' future. It delivered their first chart-topping single, It's All Over Now, and it defined the harder rock sound that was to become Jagger's trademark. Back in Britain, manager Oldham was working hard at promoting Jagger's bad boy image. He had become the master of hype.
Andrew found his true soulmate in Mick. They spent most of their time daring each other to go one step further. We were playing Berlin, and it was Andrew that spotted. The audience was virtually male. And Mick came to talk to Andrew at the side of the stage while the show was going on, and Andrew said to him, goose step back across the stage. So not only did he goose step back across the stage, he raised his right arm as well. And then the most frightening thing happened. The audience stood up and saluted him back. And that night, 180 cars were wrecked at the car park, and rock and roll concerts were banned for Berlin for the next 25 years. Now that appealed not only to Mick, but it appealed to Andrew. And the fan base got bigger and bigger and bigger because it appealed to that element that wanted to revolt against their parents, against everybody.
Wherever the Stones played, Jagger triggered. His preening, prancing performance was embellished with lurches, twists, and slides, picked up from performers he'd observed in America, notably James Brown. Jagger's control over the band intensified, while its founder, Brian Jones, became increasingly isolated.
They were recording the single, Little Red Rooster, and Brian had been going on to me about how excited he was. Brian walks into the studio expecting all the band to be there. They'd actually recorded the track the day before, and there, leaning against his guitar amp, was a note saying, play only on these 24 bars, nothing else. And again, it was like horror, because they'd done the whole song without him, and they didn't actually want to be in the studio with him. And he had a written list of instructions as to where he could put his slide guitar. And anybody who listens to Little Red Rooster, the slide guitar, apart from Jagger's vocal, is the kind of whole killer point of the song.
I think once the sort of Siamese twin act of Keith and Mick came together to write the songs, it was the prelude to Brian being pushed right into the background. What was essentially his band when it became, as a rhythm and blues band, had now become the Keith, Richard and Mick Jagger show. More especially the Mick Jagger show.
The Last Time, Satisfaction, Get Off of My Cloud. In 1965, the Jagger-Richard songwriting partnership took flight with a spate of classic hits. On both sides of the Atlantic, they established Jagger as the world's #1 rock and roll anti-hero.
There were camps. Either you liked the Rolling Stones or you liked the Beatles. There was no in between. When the Stones came, for me, it gave it that little bit of quality of being taboo. The Stones were a little bit what your mother didn't want you to listen to. They absolutely were a very big part of the fashion sense and the culture that went with their message of liberation and freedom and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I guess that sums it up.
When this woman entered Mick Jagger's life in late 1966, it seemed the rock and roll fairy tale was complete. Singer Marianne Faithfull was the angel of swinging London.
She brought enormous influence on Mick in the type of way he dressed, the type of books he would read. The change in his social circle was dramatic.
Marianne had a tremendous sense of style. She was very funny. She had a great sense of imagination. She was an avid reader, and so was a kind of feeling of magic and mystery and adventure about her.
They were both incredibly beautiful people at a time when it was beautiful people time.
They were very much in love, but unfortunately, she developed a problem with drugs. She did not have the self-control that Mick had. Mick would only go so far. He would never allow himself to lose control. And he values control, self-control, and self-discipline above all else. He always dabbled, tried these things, but somehow, miraculously, avoided ever becoming addicted to any serious drug.
Despite his instinctive caution, a nightmare began for Jagger one evening in 1967 when 19 policemen strode down an English country lane and raided Keith Richards' home Redlands during a weekend party. Jagger was there with Marianne Faithfull.
Some of the goodies that they had sustained themselves with during this party were taken away by the police and analyzed, and lo and behold found to contain controlled drugs.
A self-assured Jagger appeared in court, charged with possession of drugs. They were released on bail, but at his trial, Jagger received a 3-month prison sentence, Richard a year. Shocked and weeping, Mick was taken by van to begin his sentence in Brixton jail. There was widespread concern at the severity of their sentences, and support came from an unexpected source.
The Times newspaper, which had been more or less the bulletin board of the establishment up until then, the oldest newspaper in Britain, came out with an editorial the day after the sentences attacking the judge and saying that the sentences were too severe.
The next day, a chastened Jagger was released, pending the outcome of an appeal against his conviction. A month later, the Court of Appeal rescinded his prison sentence and placed him on 1 year's probation. Richard's conviction was quashed outright.
That bust shook Mick up quite badly. He surrounded himself with people and with an apparatus and a machine around him. He became more of a reclusive rock star than he had previously.
There were more upheavals ahead. Jagger now wanted more control of the Stones' affairs, and it would cost some their jobs. For the Stones, it was a time of dramatic change. They felt they no longer needed manager Andrew Oldham. Their partnership had run its course. In late 1967, Jagger took over the management of the Stones' affairs at an office in the heart of London's Mayfair. Brian Jones had become a figure of pathos. Marginalized by the rest of the band and in and out of court on drug charges, he was mentally and physically in a fragile state. His personal life was also falling apart. He'd been shunned by Jagger and Richard. A succession of girlfriends had left him.
Brian and I had drifted apart, and I was living under the impression that because Brian's dream had become a reality and that the band was extremely successful, that Brian was, you know, very happy. I felt anger at the fact that the two people who should have been there protecting him and, you know, taking care of him were actually the two people who were taking the band away from him.
He got in a bit of a state like he just couldn't hack it anymore. I think it was embarrassment to Mick and the band, really.
Mick and Keith had a strong wish to tour the United States in 1969. And it's a fact that, as I looked into, that the American embassy in London would not give Brian Jones a visa to come to the US because he had a drug conviction on his record. They had to take a tough choice, and in the end they chose to fire Brian.
Jagger pressed ahead with plans for a US tour without Jones. Meanwhile, Brian retreated to the solitude of Cotchford Farm, his 11-acre estate in Sussex. He had been sacked from the band he had helped to create. Although he had been given a generous financial settlement, he missed the glamour of being a Rolling Stone. He became more and more isolated. On July 3rd, 1969, a month after being fired, Jones was found dead in his swimming pool after taking a midnight swim. The coroner recorded a verdict of misadventure, drowning whilst under the influence of alcohol and drugs, but the full circumstances surrounding his death remain shrouded in mystery.
The night the news of Brian's death came through to the Rolling Stones, I was actually with them in the recording studio at Barnes. I naturally asked the obvious question to Mick as to what had happened, because it was apparent that some really bad news had gone down. And he said, Brian's done it. Brian's done what? He's killed himself in the swimming pool. And I said, oh, it's dreadful, you know, terrible. What happens now? It goes on. It goes on. I said, oh, right, fine. So I sat in the studio, but really nobody felt like going on. Nobody felt like continuing with the recording session. And after about half an hour, it all faded away and everybody went home.
Jagger distanced himself from the tragedy, and it was left to Tom Keylock, the Stones' bodyguard, to take care of things.
But the funeral, they got me to organise it, which I did because there was nobody else. I sent them out the best way that I knew. For their own reasons, Mick and Keith didn't show. But that was entirely up to them. It was, you know, their choice. But everybody knows he wasn't there.
It was due to his musicianship that the songs of Mick and Keith actually became hits. They don't even come close to crediting Brian with what he deserves. I still have that part of me that remembers that nice, kind, generous Mick. So it's very hard for me to actually imagine this other Mick Jagger. I don't feel that I know him. Maybe it's a case of, you know, if you don't speak about it, it'll go away.
2 days after Brian's death, the previously arranged free concert in London's Hyde Park was turned into a memorial service for the late Stone.
He is not dead. He does not sleep. He has awakened from the dreams of life. It's we that are lost in stormy visions and keep with phantoms an unprofitable strife.
In a theatrical climax, thousands of butterflies were released into the air. One of those most deeply affected by Brian's death was Marianne Faithfull. She was overwhelmed by the apparent nonchalance of those around her to the recent tragedy. Before Brian's funeral, she and Jagger had left for Australia, where they were both due to appear in a feature film. Her smiling exterior masked inner turmoil. Shortly after arriving in Sydney, Marianne, anorexic and high on drugs, attempted suicide by downing 150 sleeping pills. For 6 days, doctors despaired of her life. But she survived. A long recuperation followed. But her relationship with Jagger was never the same, and they slowly drifted apart. For Jagger, even bleaker times lay ahead. The Rolling Stones were about to tour America, but the trip would end in tragedy. In '69, Jagger and the Stones returned to America after a 3-year absence. The tour was a huge success. Jagger announced the final free concert would be on Saturday, December 6th at Altamont, a remote speedway track 50 miles from San Francisco. It was a symbolic gesture. San Francisco had been the birthplace of '60s flower power and the peace and love generation with their gospel of free sex and free drugs. What better location for Jagger, the prince of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, to hold court with 350,000 of his acolytes? The bad boy of rock chose the baddest boys of all to police his concert, with fatal consequences.
The Hells Angels got increasingly violent. They attacked various people in the crowd. I saw people running as the Hells Angels grabbed their lead-tipped pool cues and swung them wildly in the crowd. It was a macabre and ghoulish and ultimately horrifying scene. It was fascinating watching Mick Jagger that evening. He didn't realize how quickly things could get out of hand.
Brothers and sisters, come on now. That means everybody just blew out.
The climax of the concert came as Mick Jagger stood on the stage in his harlequin outfit. It was kind of a satanic cloak that he wore, half black and half crimson, and sang Sympathy for the Devil, not realizing that in the crowd in front of him, a young man by the name of Meredith Hunter was in the process of being stabbed to death by the Hells Angels.
I don't think anyone was aware of what had actually happened, that someone had actually been killed in the crowd at the time, because the main concern was just that it was an awful situation out there, and we were just trying to get out.
That evening after the concert ended, Jagger and the rest of the Stones got on a helicopter. It was in a scene really reminiscent of the fall of Saigon.
It really felt like we were on the last chopper out of Nam, because there was only one helicopter and that could take 8 people, and there were 17 people in it, and it was listing heavily.
By the end of the day, there were hundreds of injuries, 4 deaths, and over 2,000 people were treated for serious drug overdoses. It really was, in essence, a catastrophe. It marked the end of the peace and love generation. Many of us who were there, I think, felt that the 60s ended with Altamont. And it also solidified Mick Jagger's reputation as the dark prince of rock and roll.
In public, the Stones' bad boy image had reached its height, but in private they were starting to lead very different lives. In the early 1970s, Jagger left Britain, fleeing its punitive tax laws, and set up home in the south of France. He also set about securing the Stones' financial future, which up to now had been shaky. For 5 years, these affairs had been administered from the heart of New York City by accountant Alan Klein. While he had raked in millions, the Stones had remained relative paupers. Jagger sued him for $29 million and eventually settled for $2 million. It left a bitter taste, but it meant Jagger now had complete control of the Stones' future. And it was in France that Mick's personal life was transformed when he fell in love with and married a sultry South American beauty called Bianca. They had planned a quiet wedding in Saint-Tropez in May 1971, but the press made that dream impossible. It became a typical rock and roll event.
Most of their friends agreed that in marrying Bianca, Mick was merely marrying a reflection of himself. They were physically and temperamentally very, very similar. And throughout the 70s, they basically were the golden couple of New York society, and they partied in places like Studio 54. They were a real presence in the nightlife of New York. Mick continued to have relationships with other women, dozens and dozens of dalliances with other women. Mick has said that he believes everyone is basically bisexual, and I think he's tried everything. He has been linked to a number of famous men over the years. He and Rudolf Nureyev had a relationship, and at one time Geraldo Rivera, the television personality, talks about being approached by both of them during a party and having to rebuff their advances. David Bowie and Mick Jagger had an intimate relationship. Angela Bowie talks of finding them in bed together.
Jagger's adventurous sex life has become part of rock and roll legend. Fact and fiction have merged into one.
I firmly believe that he's a man, and he's very much all man, and although he might have a high tolerance for all sorts of sexual preference, I just think that he's a liberated spirit, and he accepts what anyone chooses for themselves. And I think that it's fine. The mystique of not knowing completely who he is and what he is great for his life and his privacy and what he chooses to keep for himself.
Steve Elson, who performs as Mick Jagger in the Counterfeit Stones, has studied every nuance of that sexual ambiguity and its effect on Jagger's stage persona.
If there was one quality that sums up his power, it's his sexuality. And by that I mean, you've got somebody who can appeal to the girls and the boys and the gays as well. You know, this is...
That Mick's own personality, which is shrewd and in some ways cautious, sizing up the moment, not truly the kind of gangster outlaw that Keith is, and wonderful, all-around wonderful human being also, is that Mick acted out Keith's psyche on stage.
I think his real wife is Keith Richards, and always has been. That's his mate for life. That will be his most consistent, most long-lasting, most definite relationship throughout his life.
Keith Richards has always been seen as the real article, the real bad boy of rock, the things that Mick has tried to pretend to be and isn't. Keith really is and has always been. And I think that's been the key to their relationship, and they both know that's the truth. The relationship between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards is an interesting love story, and I think it continues and will continue for years to come.
Jagger and the Stones had become an international business, with their world tours making millions. Global success was changing Jagger. To consolidate his superstar status, he was becoming more ruthless. At the end of the 1970s, Mick Jagger's personal life was again making headlines. In 1979, his former girlfriend, Marcia Hunt, won her legal battle to make Jagger acknowledge that her daughter, Karis, was also his. In 1980, his marriage to Bianca ended in a bitter divorce and massive media attention. Jagger was now a megastar. In the 70s and 80s, his stage performances got bigger and bigger, as modest venues were abandoned for major arenas. Under his astute management, the Stones maintained their popularity, and hundreds of millions of dollars rolled in.
He was an innovator as far as the way they used auditoriums. He was the first person to think of dressing an auditorium and having these huge sets that are now commonplace, to make those enormous auditoriums work in a more entertaining way. I think he gave audiences huge value for their money very early on in the Stones' career, and saw that as being a way of building the Stones' career, and he was right. He developed his dancing, he developed his costumes, he had an extraordinary vision of what his, in particular, worth was to an audience that went way above his ability to sing or whatever else.
But success and megastar status had changed Mick Jagger, according to this former colleague.
I think the biggest problem I had becoming press agent for the Rolling Stones was coming to terms with the people that I'd known 10 years previously and what they'd become in the interim period. Mick on tour in the 80s was a totally different animal from the 60s. By this time, he'd become quite a ruthless individual, which I accepted. I think you've got to accept that somebody that actually establishes themselves in the way that he has done as a sort of superstar and fights that corner and maintains that is going to become selfish and self-centered, because that's the only way they can survive. You know, they can't possibly survive unless they're really strong.
I was very disappointed in later years as to these mastodontic shows where they had fireworks and spent millions of dollars satisfying Mick's vanity, you know, of being a stage genius of sorts. And in the meantime, the old blues artists are still sitting in old cars, old Chevrolets driving 600 miles to do a gig for $200, you know. There was something wrong. There's something wrong here. If I'd known at the time that they would end up 30, 40 years later being so rich and not doing it, I wouldn't have helped them in the first place, you know. So that was the idea. The idea was the music and the underdog and the underprivileged and the helping, you know, the people. Not becoming semi-aristocratic nincompoops with islands in the Caribbean and God knows what else and thinking themselves as royalty, you know.
Texas model Jerry Hall is the woman who has been at the center of Jagger's life for the last 20 years and is the mother of his 4 children. But it's been a stormy relationship.
Jerry Hall actively pursued Mick Jagger. She wanted him, and she used all of her Texas charms and wiles to land him. She wasn't shy about that. Of all the women that Mick Jagger has had serious relationships with, Jerry is a standout because she has income of her own. She has her own career and her own life. Every time he strays, she takes some sort of action of her own. Usually, Mick tries to patch things up by buying something for Jerry. A house, a swimming pool, jewelry. Even Jerry says, every time he gives me a present, I wonder what he's done wrong. So, it's an interesting relationship, and it's remarkable how long it's lasted.
Jagger leads the life of one of rock's aristocrats. He now lives back in London in a mansion in one of the city's most exclusive suburbs. And Jagger's relationship with Jerry Hall still survives despite the upsets. And so do the Stones. 4 decades after they began, they can still guarantee sellout concerts around the world, helping to make Jagger a fortune estimated to be almost $200 million. He remains, as he has always been, the key to the Rolling Stones' success, one of rock's living legends.
Mick Jagger, to me, is probably the greatest rock and roll singer of our time. What Mick does best is performing in front of an audience.
Males, females, this is that. What is it exactly? And it's worked to an advantage to him.
And many people fail. There's only going to be one Mick Jagger for all eternity, as far as I'm concerned.
Like a teenager in his private life. I think the rest of us get some sort of vicarious thrill from that.